This is Nexzr, the game that caused me to buy a Duo R. That's the Japanese CD version of the Turbografx console, which was, to my knowledge, the very first CD-ROM based console system. Anyway, the story is that I played this at a friend's house and was disappointed that it's a very expensive CD. Though one day I was browsing Wolf Games, a online store that no longer exists, and I found a copy for $60, which was much cheaper than the going price. So I snagged that, and this was about the time that the Xbox 360 was new. So I reasoned, what am I going to play more? Awesome CD-based 16-bit games, or 16-bit style, or an Xbox 360, and to me that was a no-brainer. I went for the Duo R. They're about the same price. It's an expensive console, but in my opinion, it's worth it. Now, once firing up Nexzr, you have this awesome cinema scene. This was unlike anything you'd see on a cartridge-based system like the Sega Genesis. And I love that the art style is this 80s era Robotech, Macross style animation. You don't see this style anymore at all because now it's, horribly passé. But nevertheless, I think it's a really cool style, and I'm happy to see it in Nexzr. Now, one thing I gotta mention is that there are two different versions of Nexzr. The version we're seeing here is the one sold in stores with all the cinema scenes, and there's another one called Nexzr Special, which was a competition edition that adds a time attack mode, and that one omits the cinema scenes but adds, that new mode, so that might be worth tracking down as well. So right off the bat, you can see it's a space shooter, but it does a few things really differently than a lot of other games in this genre. For one, there's no bomb button. There's no getting out of situations the cheap way. Second, there's only one button used in the whole game, and that's the fire button, which also controls your sidearms. And third is a checkpoint game, much like R-Type, even though it's a vertical game, and that is itself not very common. Now, the level of memorization required in Nexzr is nowhere near as brutal as R-Type. Nevertheless, you'll have to really nail certain sections of the levels in order to continue. The music in the game is that kind of cheesy early 90s style that I think you'll either love or hate. I personally really dig this style of music. When I play this game, I'm kind of grooving along as I am blowing up enemy ships. And nearly every level in the game has a mid-boss which requires a trick or two in order to defeat. And let's talk about the graphics. They're gorgeous. I mean, even though pretty much the entire game takes place in space, you'll see things like this planet in the background that really show off the PC Engine's or Turbografx's color palette, which was comparable in some ways to the Super Nintendo and much more vibrant than the Sega Genesis. The end-of-level bosses in this game are also mostly pretty good, though some of them are uninspired. This is one of my favorite bosses in the game, but too often they're just a big starship graphic that kind of hangs there like a big sprite that doesn't really have any moving parts or segments or anything, and it looks very stiff. And now we're ready for level 3, where the shit really hits the fan. Stage 3 greets you with this awesomely disorienting diagonal scrolling, coupled with all kinds of enemies that, if you let them, which I don't in this playthrough, shoot all kinds of laser beams and missiles at you. The first few times I played this game, this part took me so many tries to really figure out. If you start this area with no power-ups, you really have to catch those quick power-ups you might have seen just now that fall really fast with the scroll speed. tell me that music isn't groovy. I hope you didn't just say it isn't because, well, you'd be wrong. Let me show you a trick on this mid-boss because otherwise it's really difficult. When he drops the shields, you go behind him, and then when he drops those little side wings, then that's when you hit him with the missiles. The game does very well with the aspect ratio that it uses. I mean, so most vertical games in the arcade, they use a vertical orientation which is basically the television on its side. So you have more vertical space to scroll than you have horizontal. In this game, you know, they make up for it by having the spread shots really, really wide. So you're hitting targets at really wide angles, and you really have to make good use of that as a player in order to succeed. And that kind of indirect fire is really the name of the game. Now here's one of those bosses that I'm not really that enthusiastic about. It's just a big sprite and doesn't really have the illusion of life. Some of the better bosses in this game are these mech battles that feel like an AI opponent. This one sure as heck does not. The game continually ramps up from here on out, and by the time you get to the last level, which is a couple levels from now, you really have to know what you're doing, because the game is going to throw all kinds of really interesting enemy patterns at you that shoot all kinds of different shot patterns that you don't see in the rest of the game. Nexzr is very good at introducing new ideas every level and keeping things fresh. Here's a tip on those snakes that come out. I'm getting chased here by them, but if you just target them when they first come out, you'll get them no problem. Now, if this isn't hard enough, there's a hard setting in which every enemy shoots bullets at you every time one explodes, so you have to continually be on the move. It's a really fun mode, but I've actually never beaten the game on the hard setting. This is normal that you're watching here. This is one of those boss battles that is one of my favorites in the game, where it really feels like you're battling an enemy starship with a smart pilot. And it's nothing compared to the last battle in the game, which is really great in that way, but pretty good. There's no doubt in my mind that Nexzr is one of the finest shoot-'em-up games you can get that whole generation. And, you know, like I said, it was the reason that I bought a PC Engine console. It's a game that I can pick up several years after I first saw it, and it still feels almost as fresh as the first time I played it. And there's still things I haven't done in it, like beat hard mode. And I have to say that a lot of the game reminds me heavily of Rayforce, a game that came later. You know, everything from the artwork style to the omission of a bomb button to you know, the way the homing lasers are drawn. You know, it's very reminiscent of that, and I wonder if this was an inspiration. So that's Nexzr, a game I highly recommend. It might be frustrating at times because of its R-type kind of gameplay, but it's never cheap, and it's never too much of a memorizer, and you'll find yourself, if you're like me, coming back to it again and again. Whoops, that's not Nexzr.